Good afternoon. We're all in. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here in this session, the business of rewilding. We're here to explore how we move nature's restoration beyond the realms of mere philanthropy into business, what's working and what's needed. I'm Naomi Conway. I'm Director of National Parks Partnerships, and I have the lucky job of working for all 15 of the UK's national parks, and we lead on creating strategic partnerships between companies and the UK's parks to do more good things in these exceptional landscapes. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been leading on a collaboration called Revere, which is aiming to leverage £240 million of private finance into restoring national park landscapes by 2030. So this is a topic that I'm really close to and passionate about, and very happy to talk with any of you about afterwards. When I chatted with the panel last week, we agreed it'd be good to set a very quick bit of context for this conversation. We know there's a funding gap of about £5 billion a year over the coming decade to meet biodiversity and nature targets in the UK. Private finance does need to be mobilised to meet this gap. There's a lot of talk about investing in nature, but from the developer side, by which I mean those bringing investable nature projects to market, there's quite limited resources to get projects at scale ready for investment, especially as project developers are often NGOs or farmers or single landowners. And as a result, investment levels to date in UK nature have been quite low. But there is good news. We know that investor appetite is high, and we're getting very close to now opportunities that can be funded at scale. Certainly from the national parks perspective, we're working really hard to get close to that. So, to talk on this topic today, really delighted to have this fantastic panel with us today. We've got Beccy Speight, who's Chief Executive of the RSPB, the largest nature conservation organisation in the UK with 1.2 million members. Also, the RSPB owns and manages more than 160,000 hectares of land with 200 reserves across the UK, which is more than I'd realised. We've got Anselm Guise at the end there, who's the owner of Elmore Court Estate in Gloucestershire, where he runs an award-winning hospitality and ecotourism business, alongside rewilding and farming using regenerative processes. And in the middle, we have Ben Goldsmith, Chief Executive at Menhaden, a sustainability-themed investment company, and also a philanthropist and environmentalist who's been at the forefront of campaigns for more rewilding in Britain and Europe. We're quite tight on time today, but we should have about half an hour of conversation, followed by 10 minutes of hopefully some great questions from you as well. So let's dive in. I wanted to start really before going into the finances and the funding side, just to think about rewilding and each of your sort of personal feelings about it. What does it feel like to rewild? And I'll start with you, Anselm, to describe your experience of rewilding.
Hello, everyone. For me, I mean, I've ever since a kid, I've been a sort of nature buff, and I've kind of stumbled on rewilding, really, like so many people, because of Isabella Tree's fabulous book, and I inherited this estate. And wondered what to do with it. And we set up a wedding venue, which has been a really big success. And land's come out of tenancies in hand. And I always thought that you had to get on an aeroplane to go and experience nature. And having read that book, it's like, oh, we could do it at Elmore. And it's just extraordinary. It seems to me that the big thing is just to give up control of what happens and allow nature to do its thing. And it's just remarkably magical what happens. And I think for me, having embarked on that, and there's such a thing where you have this, we all have this tendency, I think, to try and control and make things happen a certain way. And you have to kind of almost train yourself not to do that and allow the process to happen on its own. And every now and again, I've made a couple of mistakes, and you kind of go, no, I want this to happen, and somebody says, you do this, and you realize quite quickly, just don't interfere, let the magic happen. And I think once you start doing that, you start realizing that you can apply that same approach to almost everything, and it's sort of with the way you think, the way your wellness, the way I treat my staff now, I think slightly changed. It's kind of more, it's less mind, more heart, more gut. It's more of an embodied way of being that essentially you're being taught by nature how to be. And that alignment with it and sort of reconnecting with it is where it's so fabulous. So that's it.
That's a really great description. Ben, what does rewilding mean and feel like for you?
I don't know if people... Is this working? I don't know if people saw Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, releasing beavers in Ealing yesterday. But it was on what's been quite a frightening and sad few days globally, and in London especially, it's been quite fraught. And this kind of ray of sunshine in these beavers, a family of 5 being released into the Thames at Ealing, kind of shone through. And it matters so much to people. People are so happy about it. It's been a really big news story, not just in London, but all over Britain, because people are drawn to these stories of restoration. You know, it's like when the white storks were reintroduced in Sussex, at a place called Storage, which of course is named after the storks that were there 600 years ago. And suddenly there were storks nesting on the top of Knepp Castle, and villagers putting wagon wheels on their roof. And the BBC said afterwards that it was one of their most popular stories on their website for the entire year. The reason for that is that it's so optimistic and joyful, restoring nature, especially if you're able to participate in it. If you're the person who's able to get your hands dirty as a volunteer, pulling stuff up or cutting stuff back or releasing animals out of a cage or whatever it is, it's hugely meaningful to people, because we yearn, this is really preaching to the choir here, but we really yearn for contact with nature. And it's not just people that we find in places like this. Even the kind of snazziest London-dwelling, property-developing, fast car-driving individual also yearns for contact with nature. They just don't know it, or they don't know how to articulate it. But they're willing to pay twice the price for an apartment which overlooks the park than one that doesn't. There's a rush for the outdoors as soon as the sun comes out. And I think what rewilding does that's so important is it provides an impetus for the consciousness change that we need in our relationship with nature. It kind of sets the stage for people to reconnect with nature in a way, because it's an optimistic vision rather than a frightening one. There's a lot to be frightened about in terms of what's happening in the world of environmental kind of destruction and so on. But when it's putting species back and rewilding landscapes and glowworms returning and so on, I think it brings about a kind of consciousness shift. And I think that's why it's so important. And it's happening. I think we're witnessing a kind of upwelling of love for nature in this country. The question is, how do we turn that upwelling into meaningful nature recovery at scale? And I guess that's what our discussion here is about.
We'll tap into that in a moment. Beccy, from the RSPB perspective, rewilding or restoring nature, how much of your work is that now taking up?
Yeah, so it's definitely an approach that we've been taking over a number of decades, actually, because I think what it brings, and you both said it actually, what it really brings is it brings scale, and we know now that in order to tackle what we're seeing happening to the natural world, we have to do things at scale. And I think rewilding absolutely brings that sense of scale. But the other thing it brings, and this is the thing that most upsets me about nature loss, is what they call the great thinning. So that loss of that sense of abundance, of nature all around you. And I think rewilding is one of those things that really brings back that abundance. And so for me, being on one of our places that has been going through a rewilding process, so I think about somewhere like Haweswater up in the Lake District, or Wallasey down on the Essex coast, both about working with natural processes. They're really exciting places to be, because you get that sense of abundance, and that's what we've lost. If I think back to my own childhood, that is what we have lost. It's been the great thinning. And rewilding is absolutely a way of turning around the great thinning and bringing the great mass of nature back in a place where you can hear it, see it, feel it, and that is tremendously exciting.
It is exciting the way you describe it. And now I'm interested in what we're describing, which is something quite joyful and human. How and where does this collide with business and finance? It feels like potentially a slightly worrying place to be, to bring these two things together. So perhaps I can ask you, maybe starting with you, Anselm, how are you combining business and rewilding on your estate?
Well, I mean, I've got this lovely country house, which we do an awful lot of weddings at, and we had a meeting, a kind of conference actually yesterday, with a lot of other wedding venues, and there's an outfit called the Sustainable Wedding Alliance that came along and confirmed what I kind of already knew, but that 68% of couples choose the sustainable credentials of the places they're choosing is part of the reason their kind of selection process. And I think we're doing really, really well. We just opened 6 tree houses that kind of overlook this rewilded landscape, and the simple fact is people love it. It's a massive draw in terms of like the choices people make when they're purchasing things or choosing to buy products or services or whatever. It seems to me that people, I mean, sadly it hasn't, I don't think, quite got to the ballot box, but in terms of day-to-day kind of commercial choices that people are making, these things are really important. And the fact is, it does make you feel better. It's so joyful. We have people coming to Elmore who say this doesn't feel like England. It feels like Costa Rica or Africa or something like this. And I'm actually like, well, actually, it's just the rest of England doesn't feel like England. This is actually how it really is. And that's really exciting, you know. So I think from a business perspective, you tie these things into it, it just means your business is going to be more liked, more loved. People are going to choose to buy those products. So it just makes sense. And also, as a business owner, you feel better because you're doing good stuff for the environment and blah, blah, blah. So it's a kind of win-win-win. Why wouldn't you? So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And Ben, you're more involved in the world of finance and your day job. Where do you see nature and finance colliding?
I mean, I think the biggest win for nature we've ever seen in this country is the replacement of the Common Agriculture Policy with a new environmental land management scheme. I don't think either environmentalists or farmers or anyone else have grasped fully the scale of the change that we're going to see in our countryside. And it's incredibly exciting if it's done right. The old scheme used to just dish money out according to how much land you manage. You know, the 50% of the money used to go to the 10% richest landowners. It was a completely bonkers system. And the new scheme is directly conditional upon stewardship and restoration of nature. And the more ambitious end of it, the landscape recovery end, is really about rewilding. It's about clusters of farmers and landowners coming together and choosing a much more dramatic nature recovery plan for their landscape. You know, wetland recreation, wood pastures, coastal salt marshes, and so on. So that there is this publicly funded scheme, which I like to think of as a kind of icebreaker ship. And in its wake, you've got a flotilla of private markets which are growing up now, which are also going to provide funding on an ongoing basis for the restoration and stewardship of soil and nature. And just to pause on that for a moment, you know, I fully appreciate and accept the likes of George Monbiot and others when they say, you know, how do you value something that is priceless? You know, nature is priceless. It's beyond valuing. You know, how do you value the love you feel for your parents or your children? These things shouldn't be valued in money terms. And I agree with him. But the problem is we are valuing nature at the moment in all of our decisions. We're just valuing it at zero. In every single time, nature comes out with a value of zero. So what's changing now, because of this icebreaker ship, is that there's a flotilla of markets that are recognizing that nature produces quantifiable value to us. So we know, for example, that if you clear nature off the hills, which is what we've done in pretty much all of our hills in this country, when it rains, the water deluges into people's living rooms and causes chaos, and then 3 weeks down the line, you've got a hosepipe ban because there's no more water. If you rewild those landscapes, or if you farm them more responsibly and rebuild soil, they hold water like a sponge, which reduces flooding and also provides you with a steadier, more reliable source of cleaner water. So now the water companies, led by Wessex Water, are now paying landowners in parts of the country to restore nature and soil, just in their own self-interest, because the alternative is that they have to build very expensive treatment plants, they have to build new reservoirs. It's much cheaper for them to pay an annual stipend to a bunch of landowners in a sensitive part of the catchment to manage their land for nature and for water. So that's just one market. There's another one around flood mitigation, which is related. And then you've got more esoteric markets like biodiversity net gain. It's a regulatory market. It's government saying that if you build something, you need to create a net gain in biodiversity. It's clumsy. We don't yet know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be £100 million a year directly in the hands of landowners for restoring nature. It's meaningful, and it's about real restoration. And then you've got voluntary markets, which we can have a big discussion about the rights and wrongs of the voluntary carbon market. Is it okay for companies to call themselves net zero if a portion of that comes about because they've paid someone else to sequester carbon through nature? Whatever the rights and wrongs, if it's done properly, it's a massive sum of money. And Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, thinks that'll be a $100 billion market by 2027 worldwide. That's more money than nature restoration has ever seen, by multiples. So biodiversity is another one, biodiversity credits. So there is a flotilla of markets which are young, and they're full of cowboys, and there's uncertainty and lack of clarity. But it's the same as it was with solar power. I remember my uncle Teddy, who was a kind of batty environmentalist with a beard, in 2002, spending a fortune on a solar panel on his roof, which didn't work. That's where solar was. Everyone was being ripped off, and government subsidies were either crazy or insufficient. Well, now solar is an absolutely mainstream asset class, and it's the cheapest form of power that humanity has ever had. And I think that nature restoration is going to become like that. It's going to become a mainstream thing, that we recognize the value nature provides, and we pay for it. And that's good news for all of us around in this room that want to get about restoring nature. It's good news.
I'd agree with you, Ben, that it is early days in this space. There's a lot of potential, certainly from a national parks perspective and the work we do with Revere. Our feeling is that we as national parks want to get engaged in this nascent market to ensure that it develops in a sort of ethical and just way, that it is genuinely in the interest of nature as well. So it's in all of our interests, those of us who do care about nature and green justice, to get involved in these conversations about these emerging ecosystem services so that they can develop in the right way, so that the finance doesn't skew it into the wrong direction, I guess. With that in mind, what's the RSPB's sort of take on this? How engaged are you getting in finance for nature and the ecosystem services?
Yeah, so I think very similar to what Ben was saying, really. I think this idea of this icebreaker, so I think often we're finding that public money is what actually drives the start of these kinds of markets and these kinds of interventions. And if I think about something like peatland restoration, which we're doing a lot of in Scotland and Wales at the moment, it's been very much public money that has driven the sort of the research that's gone into how you do that, how you shape that, how you monitor it and measure it. But then what happens on the back of that is that builds confidence for businesses to come in and say, actually, we want to invest in this, we can help you scale it up, we can help you do more of it. And then you get that kind of blended kind of finance solution happening, which is really powerful, and that's what delivers the scale. And I think the other thing is that I think businesses are starting to realize that, biodiversity loss is as big a risk on their balance sheet as kind of what's happening around climate change, and that some of the solutions are joint solutions. So you get these what we call kind of natural solutions that basically use nature to tackle both biodiversity loss and the climate issues. And what that means is that businesses are starting to really think long term about that risk, absolutely face into it, and think about different valuations rather than just a straight, quick financial return. They're willing to consider longer-term valuations, longer-term returns, and I think that is definitely starting to flow through. But you're right. I think it's full of cowboys at the moment, and you're right as well, that one of the things we've got to do together is arrive at the standards we need so that we've got high-integrity markets, because that builds confidence, that builds more investment, and that builds the kind of scale of delivery that we need given the state we're in.
Hear, hear. Anselm, you had some good stats. I don't know if I'm going to make you read them out about the number of rewilding projects in the UK, because I was quite surprised that they were lower than I thought. It's worth having a read of them if you.
Yeah, this was provided to me by Alistair Driver, who's the director of Rewilding Britain. But there are 50 rewilding sites over 100 hectares across the whole of the UK, which have a landholding area of 65,000 hectares. About half of those are privately owned, and the other half, so the sort of split, he said, was 26% large private estates, 25% NGO, 22% public authority, 50% water company, 12% farm, which what's interesting is actually, I mean, we talked about this in terms of the national parks being, one would have thought should be a larger portion of it. 10 of them are actually national parks. But what's also interesting is that when places that have done rewilding have increased their employment, so across those sites, there's 119 extra full-time jobs across those 50 sites. So there's more money floating around, there's more jobs happening, and I think those farmers and those landowners who've decided to embark on this have found that their kind of portfolio is just diversified in quite a big way. So
I thought those stats were interesting because they're all brilliant projects, but we've got a climate emergency. There's a lot of work to be done, and so scale and pace is essential. How can we increase the scale and pace of this? Is it going to be down to private finance? I wonder, Ben, if you've got thoughts.
I mean, the flip side of the incentives that are starting to appear is to remove incentives to do bad things. I mean, to take a slightly different example, fishing the high seas makes no sense for anyone. Sending a ship out into the middle of nowhere in the world to catch what are quite sparse populations of fish, often with slave labor, it simply doesn't work. But world governments give out $35 billion of taxpayers' money to industrial fishing fleets each year. It's absolutely insane. And world governments give out $700 billion in subsidies to farming each year without any conditions attached, really. I mean, there's a very basic conditions attached around environmental stewardship. And what that does is create incentives to do the wrong thing. I mean, why are there 40 million sheep in our national parks and other kind of precious landscapes in Britain? Even though 83% of the lamb we produce gets exported because the market simply doesn't exist in this country to consume that much lamb. Why is that? Why does Hadrian's Wall look like it does? We've seen it all in the newspapers in the last... Well, it's because of subsidies. We subsidize the wrong things. So I just can't emphasize enough that removing those incentives to do the wrong thing and replacing them in the name of a just transition. People in national park landscapes are deserving of a just transition just the same way as people working in energy or manufacturing or any other industry. But replacing those incentives to do bad things with ones to do good things, to farm in a more traditional, extensive way, to allow wood pastures and wetlands to re-emerge in our remoter landscapes, and to produce all these environmental services that we need, I think is really a massive part of the equation. We've got warped incentives in all over the world, and I think the removal of basic payments is arguably more important than the establishment of the icebreaker, the environmental land management scheme.
Some systemic change is required. Scale and pace from an RSPB perspective, you're a big NGO, you own quite a lot of land. Have you got plans to try and increase scale and pace, or are there barriers holding you back?
I think the barriers that kind of hold us back at the moment are, finding the money, having enough money in the system to do it. And then the other thing that I think is really exciting about this is that the best way to do it is through collaboration. If you really want scale, then you've got to do those collaborations, and you can get really exciting collaborations going on, not just the obvious ones. So, the projects I'm thinking of where we've got really exciting stuff happen are often kind of, a private landowner, an NGO, some private sector money, a little bit of public money to get things going, some farmers, and that's when you get really exciting things happening. So you pool all of that knowledge, you pool all of that land. I mean, if I think about something like Cairngorms Connect going on up in Scotland, that's, I think, 4 or 5 big landowners all coming together, and suddenly you've got 600 square kilometres of land that's being kind of rewilded, reshaped through natural processes, and you're fixing things like kind of inch marshes, which is a completely screwed up, kind of river course that's suddenly going to be able to kind of work as it should. So that's when the opportunities really present themselves. So I think really good, deep collaborations, not the usual suspects, and that blended finance are the things that can really open this up. Plus, I think, regulation, getting the kind of incentives right in the policy framework will really help as well.